This is Revelation chapter 13, part 2. Going now to verse 3, it says, "And I saw one of his heads, that is, one of the 7 heads of this beast, one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast." As we have previously seen, Pagan Rome had 7 heads, that is, 7 different kings or forms of governmental structures, and those were number 1 kings, number 2 consuls, number 3 dictators, number 4 decemvirs, number 5 military tribunes, number 6 military emperors, and number 7 despotic emperors. Revelation chapter 17 tells us about the same beast, but with additional descriptive information. It says in Revelation 17 verse 9, "And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth." So we saw back in Revelation 12 part 3 that Rome has been known from antiquity as the 7-hilled city. And we saw that in this Roman coin, where we see Roma depicted as a woman laid back on the 7 hills of her capital. In the Latin, these hills are called mons, meaning mountain, and their names are Aventine, Caelian, Capitoline, Esquiline, Palatine, Quirinal, and Viminal. But not only are these 7 heads 7 mountains, but Revelation 17 tells us that they are 7 kings. In any case, a mountain is also used symbolically in Bible prophecy to refer to an empire or government. So we read in Revelation 17 verse 10, "And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was, and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, he pertains to the 7, and goeth into perdition." So again, Rome had 7 forms of governmental structures, as shown here. Revelation 17 verse 10 says 5 are fallen, and that is at the time of the giving of the revelation in 95-96 AD, 5 of those forms of government had passed from the scene. And then the same verse says, "And 1 is, that is, at the time of the giving of the revelation, the form of government that was in control were the military emperors, the imperial Caesars. They were the Caesars of John's day." Revelation 17 verse 10 also says, "And the other is not yet come, and when he cometh he must continue a short space." This other head, this 7th head that had not yet come, as at the time the revelation was given in AD 95-96, was the head of the despotic emperors. This era did not open until AD 284 with the Emperor Diocletian, and with him came the last and greatest of all the 10 pagan persecutions against Christianity, as I have previously mentioned several times before. This 7th head or form of government in the pagan Roman Empire received a mortal blow with Constantine and the Great Revolution, which saw the passing of paganism and Christianity being instituted as the national way of life. And we addressed all of this in Revelation chapter 6, parts 5 and 6, and also again in Revelation chapter 12. Now, concurrent with this was the vacating of the city of Rome as the seat of power of the empire and its removal to Byzantium, renamed Constantinople after Constantine in AD 330. Concerning these things, Joseph Tanner notes in his book Daniel and the Revelation the following. Edward Gibbon, speaking of his triumph, being Diocletian's triumph, says, quote, "It was the last triumph Rome ever beheld. Soon after this the emperors ceased to vanquish, and Rome ceased to be the capital of the empire." End quote. In the year 330, Constantine removed the seat of government from Rome to Byzantium, hence called Constantinople. After this, the 7th head, or despotic emperorship, no longer existed in the city of Rome. He then goes on and says, "Those who held rule over the western portion of the empire made their capital first at Milan, then at Ravenna, till at length, under the under the repeated invasions of the Goths, the downfall of the Western Empire was completed by the deposition of Romulus Augustulus in AD 476. And I will include here an excerpt which we've already looked at in Revelation chapter 6, part 6, and it's a quote from Edward Gibbon, referring to the destruction of the pagan religion AD 378 to 395, and he says this: "The ruin of paganism in the age of Theodosius is perhaps the only example of the total extirpation of any ancient and popular superstition, and may therefore deserve to be considered as a singular event in the history of the human mind." Edward Gibbon continues, "These vain pretenses were swept away by the last edict of Theodosius, which inflicted a deadly wound on the superstition of the pagans." And I won't read the rest of the quote, which you can read back in Revelation 6, part 6. I'll just draw attention to the remarkable statement that Edward Gibbon made when he used the words deadly wound in relation to the period in which the prophecy also uses the same phrase. And so once again, prophecy is history foretold, and history is prophecy fulfilled. History is prophecy in the making, and prophecy reflects history as it's being fulfilled. And then following all of this, in the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was overrun by the Goths principally, but also the Huns, and its lights were punched out in AD 476, and darkness fell upon the West. For all intents and purposes, it seemed to have been the end of everything in the West. And you will recall that we looked at this aspect in some detail back in Revelation chapter 8 and the first 4 trumpets, and you can refer back to this if you need a reminder concerning these details. The end of the time of the 7th head, the vacating of Rome as the seat of power, and the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in AD 476 opened the door for the 8th head to step onto the scene. This is, in Revelation 17, verse 11, the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. The prophecy concerning the 8th head is the same prophecy in Revelation 13, verse 3, "And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed." This is also the same prophecy in Daniel 7, verse 8, where it says, "There came up a little horn from among them, before whom first of the 3 horns were plucked up by the roots, and behold, in this horn were the eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things." The recovery of the Roman Empire from its mortal wound occurred under the popes of Rome, otherwise known in prophecy as the little horn, the little kingdom of Daniel 7, and I am going to elaborate on this with more of the interesting details as I proceed. Coming back to Revelation 13, verse 3, "I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death." We have been talking about the end of the 7th headship of the Roman Empire, the removal of the seat of power from Rome to Constantinople, and then the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in AD 476. All of these events combine to signify the mortal wound inflicted on the head of the beast. The prophecy then goes on and says, "And his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast." So the 7th head was wounded unto death. The Roman Empire received a mortal wound that should have killed it in the West at this time, but wonder of wonders, it did not. The prophecy states his deadly wound was healed. The Western Roman Empire revived again in an even more dangerous form than before. It became the Papal Roman Empire, and all the world wondered after the beast. And again, we must remember that the word world used here is the Greek word gi, meaning region. It's talking about the Roman earth of prophecy. This revival of the Western Roman Empire was a most momentous revolution in human history. Thus the prophecy says, all the world wondered after the beast. In Daniel chapter 2, this transition from pagan Rome to Papal Rome is recorded when the prophecy of the image there moves from its legs of iron to feet and toes of iron mixed with clay. The legs of iron symbolize pagan or imperial Rome. The feet of iron mixed with clay represents Papal Rome with its 10 kingdoms as designated by the 10 toes of the image. Now, consider this. Naturally speaking, iron and clay simply don't mix. They don't bond one with another. So how is it that they are bonded together in the feet of the image of this prophecy? That question is answered by considering the same event which is in view in Revelation 13 verse 3, that is, the head of the beast that received a mortal wound, but which was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. Edward Gibbon says this: about the close of the 6th century, Rome had reached the lowest period of her depression. By the removal of the seat of empire and the successive loss of the provinces, the sources of public and private opulence were exhausted. The lofty tree under whose shade the nations of the earth had reposed was deprived of its leaves and branches, and the sapless trunk was left to wither on the ground. Like Thebes or Babylon or Carthage, the name of Rome might have been erased from the earth if the city had not been animated by a vital principle which again restored her to honour and dominion. And then Edward Gibbon goes on to explain that vital principle which operated to restore Rome to her honour and dominion, and it was the papacy, the institution of the Roman Catholic Church. Edward Gibbon goes on, their temporal power insensibly arose from the calamities of the times, and the Roman bishops, who have deluged Europe and Asia with blood, were compelled to reign as the ministers of charity and peace. The misfortunes of Rome involved the apostolic pastor in the business of peace and war. So the revival of the beast under its papal head, that is, the 8th headship of the Roman Empire, was also in fact the bonding agent which kept Western Europe together, and it is as simple as this, and we'll demonstrate this as we read further quotes concerning the history of the matter. We read from the American Catholic Quarterly Review from January to October 1911 the following. Long ages ago, when Rome through the neglect of the Western emperors was left to the mercy of barbarous hordes, Romans turned to one figure for aid and protection and asked him to rule them. And thus, in this simple manner, the best title of all to kingly right, commenced the temporal sovereignty of the popes, and meekly stepping to the throne of Caesar, you almost choke on some of these words, but let's read on. And meekly stepping to the throne of Caesar, the vicar of Christ took up the sceptre to which the emperors and kings of Europe were to bow in reverence through so many ages, from sentiments of respect for the dignity of his office, and because he was the only mediator whom they recognized in their almost interminable wars. Dr. Dollinger writes in his book The Church and the Churches, or the Papacy and the Temporal Power, 1862, this: out of the chaos of the great northern migrations and the ruins of the Roman Empire, there gradually arose a new order of states, whose central point was the Papal See. Therefrom inevitably resulted a position not only new, but very different from the former. The new Christian empire of the West was created and upheld by the Pope. The Pope became constantly more and more, by the state of affairs, with the will of the princes and of the people, and through the power of public opinion, the chief moderator at the head of the European Commonwealth. In short, the whole of Western Christendom formed in a certain sense a kingdom, at whose head stood the Pope and the Emperor, the former, however, with continually increasing and far preponderating authority. So almost straight away, as we read the history of events concerning the Fourth World Empire, the Roman Empire, the fulfillment of the prophecy becomes totally clear. There was a mortal head wound, the beast recovered, there was an 8th head that was of the 7, like the 7, yet altogether different, and among the 10 Gothic kingdoms that were in Europe, another kingdom arose, a small horn, diverse from the first, and he reigned over them all. In this online article dealing with early medieval Europe, we read the following. Western Europe, on the other hand, crumbled into an impoverished, non-urban patchwork of Germanic kingdoms. Nonetheless, Western Europe remained united spiritually under the Pope, who had emerged in the early Christian period as the supreme figure of Western Christianity, and linguistically by Latin, which remained the scholarly tongue of the West. In short, the medieval West was united as Latin Christendom. Once again, we can see how it was that the chaos of the West settled down. The feet of iron and clay, these 10 Gothic kingdoms were bonded together as Latin Christendom. Here we read from a book called The Temporal Power of the Vicar of Jesus Christ, second edition by Henry Edward Manning, D.D. And this gentleman was a Roman Catholic cardinal who had converted from Anglicanism. Now, I don't think that it takes too much effort to convert from Anglicanism to Roman Catholicism, as the two are not that far removed from each other, but I'm digressing. Henry Manning writes this. Now, the abandonment of Rome was the liberation of the pontiffs. Whatsoever claims to obedience the emperors may have made, and whatsoever compliance the pontiff may have yielded, the whole previous relation, anomalous and annulled again and again by the vices and outrages of the emperors, was finally dissolved by a higher power. The providence of God permitted a succession of eruptions, Gothic, Lombard, and Hungarian, to desolate Italy and to efface from it every remnant of the empire. The pontiffs found themselves alone, the sole fountains of order, peace, law, and safety. And from the hour of this providential liberation, when by a divine intervention the chains fell off from the hands of the successor of St. Peter, as once before from his own, no sovereign has ever reigned in Rome except the Vicar of Jesus Christ. In this online article dealing with medieval Europe, empires, kingdoms, and rulers, we read this. By 364 AD, the Roman Empire had been definitively split into two separate states, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. The Western Empire soon collapsed under the weight of barbarians, and Europe was plunged into the medieval era. Under barbarian rule, civilization decreased dramatically, with only the church remaining as one of the few institutions for civilization. Now, it is vitally important to note what this article states. While everything was falling apart, the institutions of civilization were being removed, the church, or the religious element of society, continued unabated. The same article goes on and says, however, this period was crucial to Western history because modern Western nations directly trace their roots to the kingdoms of this time period. The seat of the Caesars of old revived again in the office of the Bishop of Rome, for he became the new Caesar, the Pontiff Maximus, which was one of the titles of the Caesars of old. In the Horae Apocalypticae, Eliot quotes from the pontifical writer Flavio Blondus, who said this, quote, "The princes of the world now adore and worship, as perpetual dictator, the successor not of Caesar but of the fisherman Peter, that is, the supreme pontiff, the substitute of the aforementioned emperor." End quote. Eliot also quotes from another pontifical writer, one Augustine Stuccius, who said this, "The empire having been overthrown, unless God had raised up the pontificate, Rome, resuscitated and restored by none, would have become uninhabitable and been a most foul habitation thenceforward of cattle. But in the pontificate it revived as with a second birth. its empire in magnitude not indeed equal to the old empire, but its form not very dissimilar, because all nations from east and from west venerate the Pope not otherwise than they before obeyed the emperor. And what does the prophecy say? One of the heads was wounded unto death, but its deadly wound was healed. The Roman Empire transitioned from legs of iron to feet of iron mixed with clay. A little horn, a little kingdom came up in the midst of the 10 kingdoms. This little horn had a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. This is exactly what history demonstrates occurred, and we will continue to look at this as we proceed. In Robert Carangola's book, The Present Reign of Jesus Christ, he includes a quote from Jude de Broye, who said this: "The Bishop of Rome mounted the throne whence the emperors fell, and took little by little the position rendered vacant by the desertion of the successor of Augustus." Joseph Tanner, in his book Daniel and the Revelation, provides this quote: "Mr. Leck, author of the History of Rationalism, speaking of the development of the papacy, says, 'It is no other than the ghost of the deceased Roman Empire sitting crowned upon the grave thereof.'" In the book Britain in Prophecy and History by P.W. Thompson, the writer includes the following quote taken from a book called A Short History of Medieval England, written by Mr. Gordon Smith and published by Burns, Oates and Washburn, who describe themselves as publishers to the Holy See. On page 7 of the introduction, it says this, quote, "In reality, the 4 centuries of Roman imperial influence had not been completely blotted out. In fact, it would be fairly safe to say that whatever of the old Roman traditions had been lost during the period of the barbarian invasions was sooner or later restored by the Catholic Church. Chief of these traditions was that of the unity which had its centre and authority in Rome." End quote. From the book called The Rise of the Medieval Church and Its Influence on the Civilization of Western Europe, etc., 1909 by Alexander Clarence Flick, we read the following. "The removal of the capital of the empire from Rome to Constantinople in 330 left the Western Church, practically free from imperial power, to develop its own form of organization. The Bishop of Rome, in the seat of the Caesars, was now the greatest man in the West, and was soon forced to become the political as well as the spiritual head. To the Western world, Rome was still the political capital, hence the whole habit of mind, all ambition, pride, and sense of glory, and every social prejudice favoured the evolution of the great city into the ecclesiastical capital. Civil as well as religious disputes were referred to the successor of Peter for settlement." From the book Outlines of the World's History by William Swinton, we read this. "On the overthrow of the Western Empire, the Bishop of Rome, as the first personage in what had been the capital of the world, was naturally invested with great influence, and looked up to not only in religious matters, but even in political affairs. Indeed, in the universal wreck, it was the Church alone that kept up the organization of society. The very barbarians who overthrew the Roman Empire were themselves brought under the sway of the Church, for, barbarians though they were, the Teutons had a deep vein of earnestness in their character." Again, the state of affairs in Italy had much to do with giving the Roman bishops great influence. This entire historical narrative concerning the transitioning of pagan Rome to Papal Rome is succinctly summarized in Revelation 17 verse 8, which says, "The beast that was, and is not, and yet is." The beast that was speaks of pagan Rome. It was not when it received a deadly wound that should have killed it, but then it says, "and yet is." It revived and continued as Papal Rome, and the matter is as straightforward as that. Joseph Tanner also goes on further and says this. Professor Bryce further tells us how Boniface III showed himself to the crowding pilgrims at the Jubilee of 1300, seated on the throne of Constantine, arrayed with sword and crown and scepter, shouting aloud, "I am Caesar, I am Emperor." In the book View of the State of Europe During the Middle Ages, 4th edition by Henry Hallam, the writer talks about papal authority in the 13th century, and he's speaking about the noonday of papal dominion and says, Rome inspired all the terror of her ancient name. She was once more the mistress of the world, and kings were her vassals. And lastly, as I conclude this second part, we read from the book The History of Protestantism, Volume 1 by James Aiken Wiley, and he is speaking of Pope Innocent III, and he says this, he claimed all kingdoms as his fiefs, all monarchs as his vassals, and launched with unsparing hand the bolts of excommunication against all who withstood his pontifical will. Hildebrand's idea was now fully realized, and this Hildebrand to which he's referring is actually Pope Gregory VII, who was Pope from 1073 to 1075 and who was born Hildebrand of Savannah. The writer continues, the Pontifical Supremacy was beheld in its plenitude, the plenitude of spiritual power and that of temporal power. It was the noon of the papacy, but the noon of the papacy was the midnight of the world. Well, did this writer say that the noonday of papal dominion was the midnight of the world? Papal Rome held itself out to be the bearer of the light of the gospel to this world, but in reality, as its own sun shone the brightest, the world was at its darkest point because Papal Rome hid the glorious light of the gospel of Jesus Christ from the world, and these were dark and terrible days indeed. When we contemplate these things, we start to realize that Rome revived under its papal form, which came forth in the guise and the cloak of Christianity, was a most terrible wonder indeed, a truly dreadful beast, almost too difficult to describe. Hence we read in Daniel 7 verse 7 concerning this, after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it, and it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. No wonder it bothered the prophet Daniel. He says in verse 15, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit in the midst of my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. And then also in verse 28, as for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me, and my countenance changed in me, but I kept the matter in my heart. This is the mystery of iniquity at work, and it's not pretty. This is the end of Revelation 13, part 2.